like to thank Owen for starting us off in the way that we want to start. I'd like to thank Owen for, I'm reminded of Simone Weil, who wrote that absolute unmatched attention is akin to prayer. And what we know about your attention on Owen is that your heartbeats start to synchronize. What we don't know is that much about what happens with neurology, with your neuroscience. And yet, that's what we're going to step into over the next 3 days. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Brian Lawlor.
So thanks, Dominic, and welcome everybody again. So my name is Brian Lawlor. I'm Site Director for the Global Brain Health Institute here based at Trinity College, Dublin. And I think we've had a fantastic warm-up there from Owen. I think I was saying to Owen earlier on that, music is a full brain workout, and I think your brains are completely warmed up now, so you're ready for this session on conflict. So the whole world is in a terrible state of chassis. Now, these are the words of Captain Boyle at the end of Sean O'Casey's June and the Paycock, set in Dublin during the Civil War period. So chassis really conveys a great sense of crisis and chaos and conflict that was in the war, that was operating in Dublin at that time. And chassis is still very evident around the world today. So this session will address the impact of conflict on our brain health, both locally and globally, and at an individual and at a collective level. So I hope that we will address a number of the big questions, such as what happens to our brains in times of conflict, and what is the impact of conflict on our brains over time. But more importantly, what can we do about it? And can we predict or prevent the effects of conflict and violence on our brains? And are there any particular effective interventions? So in the session this morning, we're going to have 3 speakers, and they will address these issues and themes from their own unique perspectives and their own experiences. So first up, we're going to have Ciaran Mulholland, who will describe the impact of the Troubles in Northern Ireland on the mental health of people living there from his perspective as a psychiatrist and as a mental health practitioner. Then we'll have Agustin Ibanez, who will take a deep dive into the neuroscience of conflict as it relates to the impact on ex-combatants from Colombia. And what are the learnings from this experience? And then our last speaker, Thomas Chadefaux, will provide a unique perspective on how large data sets might help us predict war and global conflicts. So we will have some time after each speaker for some questions. And then I hope that we'll have maybe 15, 20 minutes at the end to have a robust discussion with you, the audience, as part of a Q&A and part of the panel discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ciaran Mulholland. Ciaran is a consultant psychiatrist with the Northern Health and Social Care Trust in Northern Ireland, and he's clinical senior lecturer at Queen's University Belfast School of Medicine. He's also a fellow at the George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace and Justice at Queen's. Ciaran has provided advice to the Commission for Victims and Survivors on the needs of those affected by the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and he's also a member of the Contact Armed Forces group that coordinates services for veterans with mental health difficulties across Northern Ireland and the UK. So Ciaran is going to talk to us about troubled times, troubled minds. So over to you, Ciaran.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Am I speaking through? I'm speaking through this mic, yes? Yep. Okay, so I probably will walk around a little bit. I like to move around. So I've already commented to the organisers, it's such a crowded place. I'm afraid I'll fall over something if I walk around too much. I'm going to time myself. Brian said of all the time in the world, but it's better that I stop eventually, so I'm going to time myself. It's great to be here, so thank you very much to Dominic and Brian and others for the invitation. It's a great event. Very ambitious event, the way it's just been explained by Brian. That's a lot, isn't it? It's a lot to try and to get to grips with and to engage with. But I think Brian's right, we need to do this, and the point he made at the end about some robust discussion at the end. So let's have a robust discussion, let's have a challenging discussion, let's challenge each other. We're not going to change anything unless we challenge each other. So I've 30 minutes approximately. My subject is the troubles in Northern Ireland, it is the conflict, the violence, so obviously it is an emotive subject. It affected everyone who lived through that period of time, north and south, so that'll apply to many people in the audience. The lights are so bright I can't actually see you, so I don't know how old you are, but some of you at least must have lived through it. And it is an emotive topic. And the point that's just been made about the music earlier, that our heart rate's synchronized and our heart rate's slow, it's like a form of meditation. I know when I give these talks, my heart rate increases. I don't get nervous about public speaking, it doesn't bother me, it's the topics. It touches upon something. It reminds me of the past, and sometimes it's just a word, a phrase, a photograph, and it brings it back. And it's important for me to understand that, to acknowledge that in myself, because that says something about me, my brain, how it's affected me, how it's marked me. We're only just beginning to understand this. A greater understanding of the neuroscience of what actually happens to the injured brain, the psychologically injured brain, is very, very important. We have to be realistic. We're not going to change everything. We're not going to change world politics or local politics through neuroscience in some kind of direct cause and effect. But understanding what happened is very, very important. So my topic is the troubles. I gave a talk a few years ago in London, I think, and there was another speaker in the room who was speaking about the experience of the Balkan Wars, the ex-Yugoslavia, the wars that happened there. And she came up to me afterwards and she said, well, why do you talk about the troubles? Why do you call it that? And she said, you seem to be diminishing what happened. Why don't you call it a war? Where did that word even come from? Which did make me think, where did the word come from? And I don't know whether anybody in the room knows where these words come from. Why do we talk about the troubles? But it's actually not new. It actually goes way back. It goes back to the English Civil War period, or the War of the Three Kingdoms, because there were three kingdoms at the time, or the Cromwellian times when Cromwell invaded Ireland. That period of time where it was talked about as the troubles. Afterwards, it was talked about the troubled times. 1798, the 1798 rebellion was talked about as troubled times afterwards. And of course, it happened here in the late 1910s, the 1920s, the War of Independence, the Civil War was often referred to as the Troubles, but especially in the North in that period, it was talked about as the Troubles. So it's an old word with an old provenance. When everything exploded in 1969, it was very quickly applied again. But it's a euphemism, isn't it? Troubles. There's some we talk about. There's trouble down the road. There was trouble last night. But what it means is it means death, and it means mayhem on a large scale, which I'll talk about. Now, it seems appropriate that you have convened this event, Brian, Dominic, and others, because we are just on the cusp of the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement. It has two names in common parlance, in day-to-day language. April the 8th is the 25th anniversary. People might have different views of the Good Friday Agreement. It was a landmark in the sense that it brought a more peaceful period. It opened up a more peaceful period. But we know, everyone knows, it didn't solve all of the problems. And the arrangement, in the sense that it copper-fastened division, was never going to solve all of the problems. But nevertheless, it was a landmark that opened up a new vista for most people. And most people went into the next period with a sense of hope. The Good Friday Agreement itself said very little about the victims and survivors of the troubles of the conflict. Almost nothing, you might argue, apart from this little clause that you see on the screen, where in the preamble, in the first several paragraphs, the authors referred to the tragedies of the past, leaving a deep and profoundly regrettable legacy of suffering. And they went on to say, we must never forget those who have died or been injured or their families. And we can best honour those who have died and those who were injured and their families through a fresh start, in which we firmly dedicate ourselves to the achievement of reconciliation, tolerance and mutual trust, and to the protection and vindication of the human rights of all, which were powerful words, well-meant words, but of course some of the victims and survivors thought, well, essentially meaningless words. It doesn't deliver anything to me. And it has taken a long time to get where we are now, 25 years later, where we are trying in a more meaningful way to address the consequences of the violence and the suffering of those who were at the sharp end of the events. So my content, a little bit of context. So we'll talk about the victims, the impact of the violence, The health service response, both the response of physical health services, general health services, A&E departments, surgeons, but in particular the mental health response. I'm going to say a little bit about the Omagh bomb and the lessons that were learned in the aftermath of the Omagh bomb, because that was a turning point in terms of the mental health response. Then a little bit about the Regional Trauma Network. I'm the clinical director of the Regional Trauma Network. It was in a cross-sector network of organisations in community, voluntary, third sector, and the statutory sector working together, which has recently been brought to fruition. I'll say a little bit about the Troubles Permanent Disablement Payment Scheme, which is a very long title for what is commonly known as the Victims' Pension, which was just initiated 18 months ago. And then I'll just wrap up with a few comments about the future. So the context, I think most people know the context in the broad sense. I mean, Northern Ireland didn't exist just over a century ago. It was born out of the partition of Ireland in 1921. And it has existed in a state of some turmoil ever since. It's a contested place. Now, there have been long periods of peace, but the periods of peace have been punctuated by episodes of violence, most notably in 1935, when there's widespread rioting in Belfast. In the Second World War period, when there was an IRA campaign, fairly low-level intensity. Another IRA campaign in the late 1950s, early 1960s, again, low-level intensity. But of course, from 1969 onwards, the explosion of what became known as the Troubles. The pictures illustrate the point. The top left-hand side there is rioting in the York Street area. And one of the reasons I mention that is because that area, which is contested in the 1920s, was contested in the 1970s, and is contested today. That's part of the geography of the conflict in Northern Ireland, is that the street corners where people are shot by snipers in the 1920s were the same street corners where people are shot by snipers in the 1970s. Literally the same street corners. Some of the other images are from the 1950s that became known as the Border Campaign. Now, the Troubles erupted 1968, 1969, but it is worth mentioning that in the 1960s, in the period just before the Troubles, it was the most peaceful period in Northern Ireland's history, and it was a period of time when Catholics and Protestants were coming together as never before in terms of geographical location of where they lived, and especially in the workplaces. A lot of workplaces were divided in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, but with the coming of the Education Act after the Second World War, with the National Health Service, with the burgeoning of the civil service, and with the growth of industry in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was more intermingling than been for a long time. The rate of intermarriage, for example, went up significantly during the 1960s. But all of that was torn asunder in 1968, 1969 for reasons that are too complicated to go into. And we had a period of very intense violence from 1969 up to about 1974. And in fact, one of the markers of this is the forced population movements that we saw in Northern Ireland in that period, in the early 1970s, which were on a scale that hadn't been seen in Europe since the end of the Second World War. Tens of thousands of people had to leave their homes under duress. We didn't see anything like it again until the ex-Yugoslavian wars in the 1990s. The civil disorder and the violence was very intense through the 1970s, but began to diminish in time. The scale of the conflict, now it can be quite difficult to grasp the scale of a conflict even when you live in the midst of it. But we have to think about the numbers firstly, but then we have to set the numbers in context. So 3,700 people approximately died in the north. 100 people plus died south of the border, 100 people plus died in England, Scotland, Wales, but mostly the casualties occurred in Northern Ireland. 100,000 people were injured. The lower estimates depends on walking into an E department, a casualty department, and being registered. But many people were injured during the Troubles and they weren't counted. During rioting or bomb explosions in the 1970s, nobody was counting the numbers, or people didn't go to hospital. At least 40,000 shootings and 17,000 bomb explosions. Approximately 30,000 people went to prison because of politically motivated actions, so paramilitaries or people caught up in riot situations, mostly young men, of course. Tens of thousands joined paramilitary groupings, and paramilitary groups, for those who don't know, are armed illegal groups from either community, of which there were perhaps about a dozen. There were big players like Provisional IRA and then smaller players. Tens of thousands literally passed through their ranks. The Ulster Defence Association, for example, in the early 1970s at one point was claiming that it could mobilise 60 or 70,000 men within a day or two if it had to. Probably exaggerated, but tens of thousands nevertheless. Hundreds of thousands of locals joined the security forces, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the Royal Ulster Constabulary Reserve, part-time reserve, and the Ulster Defence Regiment, and passed through the ranks of those organisations over that period of time. And of course, many members of the British Army from England, Scotland, and Wales also served in Northern Ireland. Probably about 300,000 across the years of the conflict. A number of surveys have shown more or less the same thing, which is about 40% of the population had a very direct experience of the conflict. That is, they were personally injured, or somebody close to them was injured, or somebody close to them died. But it's about a 40-60 split. The other 60% did not emerge unscathed, but their experience was a little bit more distant. But nearly everyone who lived through that period will have some experience of being close to a shooting, close to a bomb, something happened. It just wasn't very, very up close. And most people in Northern Ireland tend to discount the minor. They tend to play it down. If you say, did the Troubles affect you? They say, oh, not really, didn't affect me. But if you get beneath the surface, well, it might have affected them in a number of ways. They just don't think about it like that. It's just the way it was. And it is worth thinking about the scale of the conflict in comparative terms, because Northern Ireland's a very small place. In 1971 census, it had a population of about 1.5 million, very small. So if we extrapolate the figures from Northern Ireland to the United Kingdom, which in 1971 had a population of about 45 million, or the United States of America, which in the 1971 had a population of 211 million, and we multiply the numbers up, we can see the scale begins to look a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more graphic. So the number of dead, for example, would be 110,000 in a UK context, and if there was a period of conflict on the streets in the United Kingdom context, resulting in 100,000 dead to the whole world, that would look like a major conflict. In the United States context, over 500,000 dead, and the same for the injured, the same for the numbers who went to prison. The numbers all multiply up, and they look on the page, on the screen. They actually can take you back a little bit. Now, the violence has diminished greatly since 1998. Of course it has. It has diminished, but it hasn't ended, unfortunately. And we know that. We all know that. There's been a shooting in Omagh within the last few days in which a police officer nearly lost his life. That shooting was mixed up, it appears, with outright criminality and drug gangs, and even with a connection to the south of Ireland. But nevertheless, in another way, it is very much related to the ongoing existence of the paramilitary groupings. The paramilitary groupings can still put on shows of strength. If you see in the top left-hand corner, that's the new IRA show of strength. And paramilitary groupings in the loyalist community can still threaten a return to violence, and do threaten a return to violence, and continue to mobilise and to recruit especially young people. The latest estimate of the number of young Protestant men belonging to the UDA and the UVF is about 13,500 in their ranks. So we're not talking about small organisations, we're talking about very, very large organisations. Paramilitary punishment attacks, so-called, continue on a fairly regular basis, and that's where paramilitaries mete out rough justice, where they beat people up with baseball bats or hurling sticks, or they shoot people in the limbs, in the legs or the arms, in order to inflict grievous injury because the person allegedly is breaking into houses or stealing cars, or is a child abuser, whatever it might be. That means there are new victims and survivors of our conflict every day. We continue to cause hurt to our neighbours. Now, but the peace process has been with us for a long time, since the 1980s, and it continues today, and it has had a demonstrable impact on the day-to-day lives of most people. Now, it hasn't been plain sailing. Again, everyone knows that, I'm sure, in the room. So since 1998, when we agreed governmental structures, since then, the governmental structures have only been stood up about 50% of the time, and have been stood down about 50% of the time because of disagreements. So within the agreement, there's many disagreements. We're in a period of disagreement at the moment. Since February 2022, we've had no functioning government. And between 2017 and 2020, we had no functioning local devolved government for 3 years, a world record, more than 1,000 days. Now, of course, that's a bit deceptive, of course, because even when we've no local government, we're within the framework of the United Kingdom, so government continues to function and the civil service functions. So the impact on mental health. It can be hard to pin these things down, and I'm going to explore that across the next few slides, across the next few minutes. You probably can't see that terribly well. Some of these slides get a little bit blurred on a very big screen, but that's a World Health Organization estimate of the percentage of males and the percentage of females in countries across the world who have a mental health problem, significant mental health problem. And if you can't see that, I don't think I've got a pointer, do I? I don't seem to. But way up in the top right-hand corner, you should be able to see Northern Ireland there, right beside the United States of America. Further on out on the graph, you can see Australia, way up at the top, highest rates, male and female, way down this end, you can see Vietnam, Colombia, Indonesia appear to have low rates. Now, it depends what question you ask. Are we comparing apples and apples here, or apples and oranges? What exactly is being described here? Or are we talking about countries, for example, many Asian countries where people don't talk about mental health problems, or don't conceptualize their difficulties as being a mental health problem? So we have to be careful about this, but nevertheless, Northern Ireland is up on that end of the graph in terms of advanced capitalist countries or westernized countries as one of the countries with high rates of mental health problems. So we do seem to have relatively high rates of common mental health disorders. I'm going to run through this in a second. Post-traumatic stress disorder, psychotic illnesses, addiction. Suicide, we talked about suicide a lot for a period of years, that we had high suicide rates compared to south of Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales, and maybe that was connected to the Troubles. But it turns out that the figures were entirely misleading, that the numbers hadn't been counted properly, in effect. So that's now been discounted. So if you do a Google search and you see high rates of suicide in Northern Ireland related to the Troubles, discount it for the moment until there's new publications which tidies up with what has been misleading research. So you're probably not going to be able to read that, I would imagine. But common mental health disorders, how do we measure common mental health disorders? Well, what we need to do is do large-scale stratified samples using the GHQ-12. GHQ score of 4 and above indicates something significant, probably correlating to clinically significant depression and/or anxiety. And way over on the right-hand side, as you're looking at the screen, the mean across the last number of years in Northern Ireland is about 20% of the population, significant problems, compared to England, 15%, so 1/3 greater, and that's consistent over a period of decades. Soft information, but nevertheless important information, and tells us something about the mental health of the population as a whole. Post-traumatic stress disorder, this is harder information, and this is a very important study, a landmark study which was published about a decade ago now, comparing a number of places around the globe and looking for rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it turned out in this study that Northern Ireland had the highest rate by quite some way, 8.8%. Now, this study for some people lacks face validity, in the sense that, does it make sense? Is it believable that Northern Ireland has a higher rate of PTSD than a country like the Lebanon, which suffered a civil war of many times greater scale than our civil war? Does it make sense we have a higher rate than South Africa or Israel or Mexico, but the drug wars, etc.? But nevertheless, that was the finding. United States of America second, and the further exploration suggests that this PTSD, at least in part, is related to the experience of the Troubles. There are some other recent studies, the Nicholas study that Brian and I were talking about just before we came in. Now, the Nicholas study is a long-term study following up people over the age of 50, and it's an aging study, but nested within it is good, high-quality information on the Troubles, experiences of the Troubles. And of course, people in their 50s, 60s and 70s, like me, were the generation that were affected by the Troubles the most. And if we take a subset of the Nicholas study, about 1,177 individuals who filled in a questionnaire, and part of the questionnaire was, tell us about your experience of the Troubles. And people who said, yes, I suffered a traumatic incident, a Troubles-related incident, the chances of them scoring greater than 36, which is the standard cutoff point on the PTSD checklist, civilian version, that's what the C stands for, 25% approximately would score above 36. And if we take a more parsimonious cutoff point of 45, which is definitely clinical significance, 13.5%. So 13.5% of a reasonably representative sample of over 50s in Northern Ireland who've direct Troubles experience have PTSD in the 2020s. We've done a survey recently of young people from the age of 2 up to 19, but for the purposes of this conversation, the sample between the age of 11 and 19 is most relevant. We found, this is just carried out just before COVID, 1 in 20 young people have a stress-related disorder, 1.5% post-traumatic stress disorder, 3.4% complex post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD more likely in males, complex PTSD more likely in females. The experience of sexual trauma and familial violence was most strongly associated with complex PTSD, not unsurprisingly, and exposure to war, exposure to conflict on the streets, and interpersonal violence in the home often or outside the home was associated with PTSD. So we've got to try to get beneath the surfaces a little bit, and I'll come back to it in a few slides. We also know that we've high rates of psychosis. That's probably quite a difficult slide to read. Sorry about that. I assume you'll get all these slides afterwards. The ones are a little bit fuzzy. But we have demonstrated that in Northern Ireland we have a higher rate of psychosis than we might expect. We have a higher rate than comparable areas like Cavan Monaghan, just over the border, and a higher rate than Nottingham. And I take Nottingham as a reference point, because Nottingham, in many ways, is a broadly comparable city to Belfast. It's about the same size as Belfast. It's Victorian red brick with the same industrial history, so it's a good comparison point. We have a high rate compared to most places in these islands, Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales, with the exception of London, the London suburbs, the London boroughs with a high population of Afro-Caribbean people have a higher rate again, but we all know, I guess, I'm sure most people in the audience know, that that's a different debate about what that means exactly. But we do have high rates comparatively. Now, young people, I'm going to talk about this just for a few minutes. I'm in 20 minutes now. Just for a few minutes, because this is important. We talk a lot in Northern Ireland in the north about the transgenerational impact of the Troubles, and there's a lot of talk about the transgenerational impact of violence everywhere. I'm sure this will be reflected by my colleagues when we talk about Colombia. And we worry about the next generation, and it's one of the reasons why we did our survey. As the images show, the photographs show, young people live in the shadows of the Troubles, and sometimes literally so. You know, they live in the shadows of the murals on the walls, either from a loyalist perspective on the left-hand side, that's in the Newton Ards Road, or in the White Rock Road in West Belfast on the right-hand side. The guns are on the walls, the guns are there, the shadow of the gunman still lives. So what impact does that have on people? Well, if you ask young people, if you ask 11 to 19-year-olds, first of all, you ask them, has the Troubles impacted your family? So this is young people who haven't lived through the Troubles, post-ceasefire children. And if you ask them that question, about a quarter will say, yes, the Troubles have had an impact on my family. If you ask their parents, it'll be a greater percentage. Now, that's quite a busy slide, but you'll see that if a young person says, yes, the Troubles has impacted on my family, their chances of having a mood or anxiety disorder, a diagnosed mood and anxiety disorder is significantly increased. Their chances of having PTSD is significantly increased. Their chances of self-harming or having suicidal ideation or making suicidal attempts is increased. So family experience, the previous generation, appears to be impacting the mental health of young people today. Now, more 2023 is the impact of paramilitarism, which is like that shorthand term for the continuing existence of paramilitary groupings, especially in the more deprived working class areas in the bigger towns, in the bigger cities. And if you ask young people and you ask their parents, do paramilitaries create fear and intimidation in your area? Yes or no? 23% of young people say yes. If over 40% of their parents say yes. Paramilitary groups contribute to crime, drug dealing, and antisocial behaviour. Again, about a quarter of young people, 50% of their parents say yes. Have you ever been threatened by paramilitaries? Well, 1.6% of young people say yes. Now, you might think, oh, that's not too bad, 1.6%, less than 2%. But I think actually to say that in the 2020s, the 2%, 1 in 50 young people have been threatened by the paramilitaries, I think is a damning indictment on where we are today. And their parents, it's 3.8%, 4%. I mean, those are high figures. So what does that mean? Well, again, without lingering too long over each slide, if you feel the paramilitaries are creating fear and intimidation in your area, you're more likely to be anxious, to PTSD, to engage in self-harm behaviour. Similarly, if you think that paramilitaries just have a negative impact all round, but especially if you've been threatened by paramilitaries. Now, the numbers are small. We need to be careful. We need to think about this. But nevertheless, if you've been threatened, you're in that small group of young people with very high rates of mental health problems. Care about the numbers, but it means something, and what it means is obviously negative. So what do we do about all of this, and what did we do historically? I've turned my own stopwatch off. Oh, I've got it again. What do we do about it? Well, historically, what did we do? Well, one of the things I find very interesting about our history is that the experience of the Troubles meant that Northern Ireland became a world leader in trauma care, in physical trauma care. And there were techniques and approaches established in Belfast that have become embedded in trauma care and disaster responses all around the world now. So the RVH, the Royal Victoria Hospital Disaster Plan, which was created and built by William Rutherford, who was a surgeon who had been a missionary, a medical missionary in India at the time of partition, and he saw the carnage of partition in India, and he came back to Belfast, and he was in the Royal just at the beginning of the Troubles, and he put into action what he called a disaster plan. This is how we mobilise to respond to what's happening on the streets, and now hospitals all over the world use the same plan in essence. Dennis Coppell and Bob Gray, who are anaesthetists in the Royal Victoria Hospital, realised in the early days of the Troubles that too many people were dying very quickly after bomb blast, not because they'd actually been physically injured, but because the blast had damaged their lungs and they drowned in their own secretions. And they instituted something called positive end expiratory pressure, PEEP, as a way of keeping the lungs slightly inflated. So whenever you breathe out, rather than your lungs collapsing, your lungs remain slightly inflated, which saved the lung, preserved the lung so that people survived. Still works today. Titanium cranioplasty, so if you have a bullet wound to the head or any injury to the head and your skull is shattered and your skull needs to be rebuilt, it is rebuilt all over the world now through the use of titanium. And the titanium cranioplasty technique was developed in Belfast in the 1970s through a direct collaboration with the local industry, where the first titanium plates were created in local factories. On a DIY basis with local neurosurgeons, and now save lives all over the world in every conflict. The Belfast fixator and the Belfast techniques were two different approaches to maintaining limb integrity. So if your legs had been badly damaged in a bomb explosion, or you'd been shot in the legs, or you'd been shot in the legs deliberately by paramilitary groups as a punishment, a high chance of losing your limbs, but the Belfast fixator and the Belfast technique were developed in order to save the limbs, without going into any detail here. And again, exported around the world and saved the limbs of countless tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps around the globe ever since. Mental health services. Have we led the world? Well, I think unfortunately we have not led the world. So why is that? Well, it's complex. But it's not that mental health services didn't respond. Mental health services and GPs at times were overwhelmed, but in general, they held the line. But of course, in the 1970s and the 1980s, primarily that meant the prescribing of medication. Mental health services weren't very well developed, psychological therapies weren't very well developed, and the scale of the problem was too difficult. A multiplicity of community and voluntary sector organisations did develop from the ground up, especially towards the end of the conflict, towards the end of the worst years and after the Good Friday Agreement, and those are the groups that I work with today. But the statutory sector could be criticised for not really having got to grips with what was happening on our doorstep. There was an element of denial, which I noticed myself when I first began working in the health service 35 years ago. There was a greater organised effort after the Omagh bomb in 1998, and then there were later developments, which I'm just going to cover briefly. So it is worth noting, of course, that we weren't immune from the violence. There was violence everywhere, and that meant there was violence in the hospital setting. So, for example, Moira Drum, who was a very prominent Republican, was shot dead in her hospital bed by loyalist paramilitaries in the 1970s. A number of soldiers, policemen were shot dead in hospital buildings and on hospital complexes. In the psychiatric hospitals where I worked, in Grantia and Derry, for example, 2 members of the IRA came onto the site in order to assassinate a member of the Ulster Defence Regiment, but soldiers were waiting for them, and they were killed instead. Many, many examples which were there, which meant denial was one of the ways that hospital staff had to cope. So what did we do? Well, we prescribed a lot. High rates of benzodiazepine prescribed, and especially in the 1970s. Belfast Telegraph headline in 1976 described Ulster as the tranquilised province, with some justification. Today, the 2020s, Northern Ireland has one of the highest rates of antidepressant prescribing in the entire world, with higher rates in England and Wales and 23 other countries, Canada, Australia, Portugal, Denmark, Sweden and other places. We continue to be high prescribers. Justified or unjustified, we can debate. The Omagh bomb began to change everything. The Omagh bomb occurred at a particular point in history, which is literally a few weeks after the twin referenda, North and South, which endorsed the Good Friday Agreement. A sense of optimism that we're moving forward, suddenly out of the blue, the worst ever atrocity during the conflict. The only comparable event, of course, being on this side of the border, the Dublin and Mulholland bombings. Community studies in the aftermath of the bomb give us new information on PTSD, the factors that would help to embed PTSD and the factors that help to modify PTSD. And 2 landmark studies, therapeutic studies, the first being an open trial of trauma-focused CBT for victims of the Omagh bomb, and the second being a randomised controlled trial published in the BMJ for victims of the Omagh bomb, but also victims from other places in the north, other victims of the conflict, demonstrated, you can never say beyond doubt, but demonstrated very strong evidence that cognitive therapy, trauma-focused CBT, is an effective treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder related to terrorism and other civil conflict. It's important to say this because there is a constituency who would say Northern Ireland is different, everything's different, we need our own therapies, we need our own approaches, we should be eclectic, we should take a little bit of this and that and the other, but the evidence doesn't really apply to us. There is strong evidence, which is why we have developed what we've called the Regional Trauma Network. That's an old photograph now, because that's from 8 years ago, when the then health minister with the beard, who was the Democratic Unionist Party health minister at the time, helped to launch the Regional Trauma Network with myself and Michael Duffy, who's the man who led the effort to address the consequences of the Omagh bomb. He announced it on that day, and David Clark from Oxford University. That's 8 years ago. It's taken us a long time to get from there to here. The reason it's taken so long is because of governmental stasis and paralysis. Sometimes there's no government, so there's no budget and there's no money, but also because everything is so sensitive, so tentative, that it's been difficult to make the strides forward we would like to make. But nevertheless, today we have a developing network, which means that the statutory services work very closely with our colleagues in the community and voluntary sector, in particular with 6 large groups. CUNAV, who are based in Derry City, Relative for Justice, which have a presence all across Northern Ireland, but especially Belfast and Dungannon. Ashton Bridge of Hope, which is based in North Belfast. The Wave Trauma Centre, presence across Northern Ireland, and the Eli Centre and CEF, which are both based down Fermanagh, Tyrone, that end of the north. These are the 6 main groups we work with, but we work with 42 other groups. So it's statutory sector and groups in the community sector working together in a very real way under the auspices of the Victims and Survivors Service and the Commission for Victims and Survivors. I'm nearly at the end. We've also been involved, or I've been heavily involved in the development of what is called the Troubles Permanent Disablement Payment Scheme. So it's a victim's pension, as it were, which was launched not very long ago, just 18 months ago, 3,800 applications so far, many thousands more to come, and this is part of addressing the consequences of the Troubles in the sense of those who are most directly affected and their carers. So the future, well, it's about establishing something that matters and makes a difference. So we've established a regional trauma network. Can we demonstrate that the coming together of the sectors has a demonstrable added benefit? Can we demonstrate that individuals benefit from the application of evidence-based treatments? If they do, is that beneficial for their families, for communities and wider society? And similarly, if we have a victims' pension scheme, we pay reparations, if we call it that, then will that have an impact, positive impact, not just for the individuals, but families, community, and wider society. Those are the challenges, to demonstrate all of this at the same time as become part of the global research effort to better understand trauma and its consequences and to prevent trauma in the future. Final 2 slides. It is interesting to note that despite all of this, despite everything I've just said, if the UK government carries out an annual survey of well-being of everyone in the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, and it turns out every year, Northern Ireland, we have a greater sense of well-being than people in England, Scotland and Wales. Consistent finding. Why is that? Is it like a cultural thing? We don't like to complain? Or is it because we compare our today to our past, so we think, well, it's not too bad. It was worse. And the happiest place in these islands, in most of these surveys over the last number of years, has actually been the town of Omagh. Even though we had the Omagh bomb, we had the killing of the police officer Ronan Kerr 10 years ago, we had last week's events or 2 weeks ago's events, still the happiest place. It tells us something. We should be optimistic about the future, but we also need to be sober and realistic, as Seamus Heaney was, who's now no longer with us, the Nobel laureate, who said anyone born and bred in Northern Ireland can't be too optimistic. It's a realism. But on the other hand, as the mural shows, that's a mural from the Lower Newton Ards Road. It's close to where I live, but it's loyalist area. You can see the murals in the background, which are more warlike. This mural is about mental health. It's about the mental health impact of the Troubles, but it's meant to be a mural of hope, and that's under construction several years ago. So thank you for your patience, and that was 33 minutes, ran over my time, but thank you very much.
Okay. Ciaran, thanks so much. We have maybe time for one question. If there's a question in the audience here, any? Got a question here from Chris. Yeah, have we got a microphone?
Yeah. Thanks a lot. You mentioned that in the response to post-traumatic situations, there's been a high level of prescription drugs being used. You also show throughout the neighborhoods that during the Troubles there was visual art being used on murals that might be propaganda for one side or another, but in the end also to promote positive health, mental health. How have the arts been used in the response to post-traumatic situations? Is that something you've looked into more directly?
Well, it's a good question, and I did think about that when I was preparing this talk. I thought, should I build in a section in the arts? And I had some sort of provisional ideas around that, and I didn't pursue it because I thought I wouldn't have the time. But underutilised is the only answer. But in the last period of time, there have been some particularly important initiatives, mostly through visual art, through painting. So Colin Davidson, whether you've heard that name or not, he's a portrait painter. He's done a series of very large scale portraits of some of the victims of the Troubles, which have been toured into various places. That's important. There is the repainting of murals to make them more peaceful and less warlike, which has been partially successful. And Seamus Heaney and various writers. I mean, there is quite a lot going on, but the sense of your question is, no, we haven't really utilised it. I don't think most people in Northern Ireland would particularly notice or see it as a dynamic in their lives, but it's something that we have to address.
There are rare exceptions, or there are fantastic projects like the Derry Playhouse project, which you'll see in the second session in the early afternoon session. So in the early afternoon session, you'll get examples of artists that are working in response to the kind of presentations and information that you hear this morning. Brian.
Yeah, and I think this may be a topic that we should maybe take a deeper dive in the panel discussion as well, because I think that creative responses to this conflict and conflict resolution, I think, is going to be crucial. I think one thing that struck me is really the kind of the legacy and the impact on kids and children, and maybe, again, this is perhaps where creativity and the brain maybe could be, and brain health could be very, very effective, working with these kids.
Yes.
Next generation. So thanks so much for that. We'll release you and bring you back for the panel discussion. Thanks, Ciaran. Now, so it's a great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Agustin Ibanez. He's a research associate professor at the School of Psychology here at Trinity College Dublin, and he's also scientific director of BrainLat at the Universidad Adolfo Ibanez in Santiago in Chile. So Agustin is a neuroscientist who has studied the impact of conflict and violence on the brain health of ex-combatants in Colombia. And the title of his talk is intriguing. It's Peace and Violence from Brain Science to Transdisciplinary Insights. Agustin.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Brian. It's a great pleasure to me for here. So this is Agus. So she doesn't recognize me because I never use a suit, but today is a very important day. So it's a huge opportunity to talk about conflict between, Ireland and Colombia, two completely different contexts. It's also my daughter's birthday, so I'm very happy. And my other daughter is in Colombia also. So for me, it's a plenty of opportunity, and of course, bringing brain health, arts, and to understand neuroscience. So the promise is that I am going to talk about neuroscience, but I think that neuroscience needs to learn more about conflict and about arts, and this is something that I want to talk about. So I will start talking about this idea of conflict, not only as a pure cultural aspect, but also a biological aspect, but both sides together. This is for me very important to understand how neuroscience can contribute to that. And as a neuroscientist, I've been trying to push the agenda of neuroscience beyond the border of the lab. So understanding conflict and violence is a huge opportunity for that. But also to try to understand how the stress, the social stress in the world impacting the biology and vice versa, how the biology predisposes multiple physiopathological pathways to response in a sometimes pathological way to environment, and how we can use this concept of allostasis to try to connect less reductionistic approaches to neuroscience. So first of all, we have been working trying to understand how social vulnerability impacts in brain health. So in Colombia, this is a national study. We have been shown that the adversities across, social determinants of health and multiple social factors, but in particular the social adversities, have a huge impact in aging and in cognition and in functionality in aging. The same, we are now working on it to show that this happens across different Latin American countries. And also, how the socioeconomical factors constitute a critical impact, not only for cognition, but also for vulnerability to violence. So I started to connect these concepts through basic ideas. So in another study in Colombia, national level, we shown that the violence is one of the most important contributors to mental health, more than the other classical factors, right? And we started to understand how institutionalized children, for instance, or adolescent offenders, they have, they develop a kind of atypical responses to social signals like empathy or compassion or emotional recognition, or more important, emotional self-regulation that I will talk about. Also, we were trying to understand how, structures like frontal lobe or different process of neurodegenerations impact in not only in the violent behavior, but in the way that we justify our actions, how we are more cooperative or selfish regarding moral cognition, how we can punish, or we think that we should punish the other's behavior depending on the intention to harm, for instance. And also, I was trying to understand the kind of in-group, out-group relationships, and I tried to understand how the brain processes in a very automatic, fast way the impact of our cultural bias. So I was a student prejudice across indigenous population and using neuroscience to trying to show that, this is a cultural process that have an incredible, fast, automatic impact in the way that your brain is anticipating the otherness, right? But then it comes the huge conflict in Colombia. So I was looking at the numbers, and I was very shocked because, in Colombia, after 50 years of conflict, there have been more or less 7 million direct and indirect victims, and more than 350,000 deaths directly associated to the civil war. Incredible large number of displacement, and a kind of process that I am so happy to see that this started to change in Colombia. There is a kind of normalization of violence. In the previous generation, like, all the people say, oh yes, I lose this, another person, and it was becoming something that was really normal. And I just want to mention Deborah Arango. She's doing an incredible job trying to show, how we need to heal. And that's something that our previous colleague was talking about, how the violence impacts in the transgenerational fashion, and how the violence is transformed. And still we need to heal. So I had a great pleasure to work with Nature, with a set of journalists, to go in to understand the first-person view of the ex-combatants. At that time, I was already a student of ex-combatants, and my first idea was very wrong. I wanted to find a kind of cognitive or neural aspect of the brain that explained violence. And I did some kind of research in that direction, but then I realized the life of these people, and that you can see in most of the ex-combatant is vulnerability, is poverty, and an extremely amount of stress, social stress, familiar stress. And this is something that I will come back later on. Then Sarah Reardon also wrote this beautiful documentary also for Nature, showing how many scientists are trying to reshape the idea of violence in many senses, in the sense of to better understand the impact of culture and environmental in the brain, and vice versa, but also to try to understand what could be more successful, because in Colombia in particular, the reintegration process of ex-combatants has been a really, really tough process with so many failures. So as a neuroscientist, first I wanted to try to find this, typical shortcuts to identify violence. And with Sandra Baez, who will be a next GBHI fellow, sorry if that is a spoiler, we studied, and with Adolfo is around here and many other colleagues, we try to use short tasks that can easily identify a terrorist. This name terrorist, I want to apologize for that. Those are very special guys that we studied there. They are not typical ex-combatants. They were a specific set of paramilitaries from middle to top position in the hierarchy that were extremely aggressive. Some of them killed thousands of people. In average, they killed hundreds of people. In average, they have performed like 4 to 5 massacres. So they were very special people, not the typical ex-combatant, and I need to make this clear statement, right? So we used a typical task that we used with patients, with neuroscience settings, and we were able to classify with 95% of accuracy if they were these kind of criminals or other criminals or healthy, normal people, right? So this attracted the attention of the National Agency of Reintegration in Colombia, and we started to work with them. And we were able to do a study with Nano Santamaria, another fellow, GBHI fellow, with 26,000 ex-combatants, a really large number. And we were able to assess, individual factors, social factors. And this kind of shortcut, simple task predicting violence didn't work at all. So after assessing hundreds of different predictors, we found something that is obvious, but it was not for me. To predict violence, you need to understand a huge combination of different factors. We were able to predict violence because we knew who of these ex-combatants were developing violence as the process of reintegration involved, the confession of the acts, and who not. So we were able to predict with high accuracy, but not with one single predictors. The predictors were a set of combinations, and this set of combinations, most importantly, were associated to contextual and social factors than individual factors. So for instance, impulsivity or sociopathy were less powerful predictors, like, if you are exposed, if your family is exposed, if you feel that the only membership, it was the illegal armed group. So this kind of, and of course, poverty. So these kind of social factors are really important to understand violence. And when I will turn on the biological basis, I will come back about that. We were also trying to understand the extreme right and left wing position. As you may know, they are paramilitaries, they are guerrillas. Of course, there is the narco there, and there is some part of the militaries that are also involved in conflicts. It's an extremely complex conflict, but we assessed the people that was more on the left versus more on the right side, and again, we shown that the contextual factors were really more powerful than individual psychiatric traits, but the radical membership was a strong predictor from both sides of violence. This is another thing that for me is really, really very important. If you develop a kind of out-group vision, being dangerous, and just putting empathy and compassion to your own in-groups, and this becomes radical, this is making a difference. But when we look at the process of reintegration of ex-combatants in Colombia, they are very disappointing news, like 70% of them, they fail to become reintegrated. And this is, of course, from my point of view, obvious. So they are being exposed to violence for 20, 30 years. And they only have like 6-month intervention, for treating the PTSD, and that's it. Or they have legal support, the government is doing a lot to try to reintegrate them, but they are not disarming their minds. They are not working in the kind of learning process of responding to environmental stressor in a specific way associated with violence, right? And of course, we can use nudges, behavioral insights, these kind of tools that allows you to modify subtle information in the context to change behaviors. And some part of the conflict that has been very well addressed, for instance, in the pandemics, the use of behavioral insights has been very, very useful to try to change behavior. But for this kind of process, that there is a strong biological and sociocultural learning. I think that we need to go in more in depth into the systemic and huge inequalities that are in the basis of violence, first of all, and second, we need to understand the biology. And I want to repeat one more time, because I think that we need to repeat this several times. Understanding the biology doesn't mean that we don't have to understand the sociological patterns. On the contrary, I think that we have learned to split these two things, and they are really coming together in real life. And this is something that I want to. This photo is coming from Immortal Beloved. It's a film about the young Beethoven running away from his violent father. He's running, escaping from him, going in the night to a lake and swimming, and you see the star reflected in the water. And this is exactly that I want to introduce about allostatic interoceptive overload. This complex concept is the way that we response to environmental demands to self-regulating, to put in the focus like, Ian was doing at the beginning of this session yesterday, as we were talking about our hearts, and some of you were talking about mindfulness. So self-regulating your own viscera, your own body, is crucial to cope with the external demands. And the way that we cope with external demands not only have impact in your life and your behavior, it also have an important impact in your biology. And this is a beautiful paper by a colleague from Brazil, Fernanda de Felice, that's showing that this overload, this allostatic overload, that means the kind of cumulative stress in response to environmental demands. So the way that we have to respond to the world, when become stressful and repetitive, it become dangerous at biological level. So stressful conditions create changes in your microbiology, not only at your neuron level, but within your neurons, in your astrocytes, in cells that are in the brain that are impacted by the way that we respond to this stress. And this is a cumulative process. So those processes, of course, impact dementia, for instance. So the way that the level of stress, the way that you cope with that, not only impact your biology today, but most importantly, in the future. We have been working a lot to try to understand how this process impacts in other types of dementia, but the only thing that I want to summarize from this, that I see too complex slide, is that, stress have an impact not only, at this psychological level there, when you have to try to clean your mind to respond to the environmental demands, but also have an important aspect in your body, in your musculoskeletal system, in your cardiovascular system. And you can track this with biomarkers. You can see the impact of your environment between your cardiovascular system, your metabolic system, your inflammatory system, your stress-related system, and even neurodegenerative parameters. And then you can see also the allostatic interoceptive network at brain level that is affected by this demand. But the most important thing, once again, is the universe within, how your body, your interoceptive signals process these environmental demands. How is the color that you put in the level of stress that is outside. And this is exactly the same. So if you see, if you have an environment that is safe, is not dreadful, and you can learn to self-regulate, you have different levels of biomarkers, parameters, cardiovascular disease, inflammatory process, and brain regulatory process that are, more healthy than if you come from environments with, different sources of adversity, socioeconomic, violence, or any other kind of disparities. And the other thing that is very important that neuroscience needs to learn more is the way that you self-regulate is critical for this process. So this is the interoceptive aspect of this allostatic overload that I think that arts and brain health can bring together more than nothing. Because in arts, we learn how to transform our inner worlds. And this is not only poetry, believe me. So we have been started to work with Talal Rosan, Nano Santamaria, and Eduardo Herrera. The last two are coming from Colombia, to develop these multi-component interventions, for one side to change the allostatic overload, in this case in victims and displaced people from Jordan, Syrian Jordan, Venezuelans in Colombia, and multiple refugees in San Diego. So that we want to do is first measuring this truly impact of environment in your biology, that is allostatic overload, but also create an intervention. These interventions are tackling all the ways that your body can self-regulate, like, for instance, doing exercise, doing mindfulness, and trying to learning self-emotional regulation. And even with Eduardo Herrera in Colombia, we are now measuring allostatic overload in victims of the conflict, but we want to do theater, because in the theater you can learn, again, to resignify this continuous stress from the environment. So I think that this is not about how neuroscience can explain conflict, it's how we can learn to change behavior and understand the biological and sociological interactions between this process. So I think that this is that we need to learn. We are not rational minds. We are not biology or pure sociology. We are a natural blending of biological and socio-cultural factors. And it's so hard to understand in academic terms. I think that creativity can bring a lot to conflict, because can help to find ways to cope with this allostatic interoceptive overload. But for that, we need more transdisciplinarity. You know, neuroscientists have to be less reductionistic. You know, people working in art needs to work with scientists, and we have started to do that. This is my second spoiler. I see that Dominic is very angry because this Brain and Art is not yet launched, but it will be soon. So we are trying to bring different artists in Latin America and many other regions to try to help with brain health. And some of you saw the video yesterday about the musician, these two guys from San Juan. So now we want to do a project that is called Music on Wheels, and we want, with Dominic's and many colleagues, to give them a bus so they can teach guitar to children under vulnerable population, but also teach about brain health prevention and teach about value-based education, based in prosociality and in empathy and the values of the GBHI. So this kind of a project can be easily translated to, I would say, ex-combatant victims, and we hope that we can develop that in the future. We have been just started to that. And you know, art is not only like in the top to showing the strong impact of the violence. It's a tool, you know, for the people to cope with that and to try to resignify the huge impact of the violence. I want to say just, I mean, usually I put all the people in my lab and so on, but today I just want to say thank you to this guy, because he needs to be more, you know, attended by academics. He's making connections between science and art as nobody has been done. So thank you, Dominic. It's a great pleasure.
Thanks, Agustin. So stay here. Stay here for some questions. So I mean, I think you're really pulling together the arts, neuroscience in an incredible way. And I mean, maybe there's going to be a collaboration, I think, between your work and perhaps what Ciaran Mulholland is doing in the north. Maybe that introduction, that injection of arts and creativity. I mean, there's a model here, perhaps. So we've time for a few questions for Agustin. Just here, yes. Oh, Manny, yes.
So you used the word that in Colombia, after lots of experience with war and disaster and death, that some of these things had been normalized. So when you say normalized, what impact does that have in terms of mental health? Does that actually mean that there isn't actual so much trauma associated with it anymore?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, this way to normalization of violence can be measured. They are like questionnaires, and Colombia is jumping extremely up there. And we find that it's a strong, so we measure this, with self-report is the only that we can do in the ex-combatants, and that was another predictor of violence. Again, they are not single predictor of violence in our study. We have 160-something predictors. We use deep learning, and we found that one single predictor never have, like an extremely small effect. So if you have to consider normalization of violence as a potential predictor, it comes sometimes, with other contextual factors, other psychological factors, but it's really important.
So sorry, I misunderstood. So this was only asked of your particular group that you're working with, not with the wider population?
So
the idea of normalization, whether...
No. It's a phenomena in the violence. I think that is part of this kind of allostatic law, when you have to cope and develop, at some point, anormal responses to an anormal environment. So it is present across different populations. It's just that we measure that in one single study.
So one of the reasons we're going to do the living labs today, with Manny leading the session, is so that people that you can go deeper, you can take a deeper dive in your area that you're specialized in. So if you're interested in pursuing the neuroscience, stay here. If you're interested in dance, upstairs, in theatre outside, in visual arts down the road. There's another question at the front.
Question here, yeah.
Thank you. That was excellent. I had much to say. I think it was your second slide that had an image, and then two images, and one was domesticated cognition, and beside it was wild cognition. I don't think you mentioned that in your presentation.
No, what I was trying to say, the neuroscience we have been using to understand cognitive process, as an isolated process, like attention or emotion, and we have been used to study them so much in the lab. So this is what I call it domesticated cognition. Cognition in the wild is trying to understand the real life, everyday cognition, and how we need to change our conceptions about cognitive process if we want to capture this real, everyday cognition.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
So time for one more question, perhaps, if there is one.
Hi, how are you? I was wondering, for your personal point of view, because in the previous presentation, they show us how the PTSD has like a stronger impact in Northern Ireland or in Ireland in general, but compared with countries from Latin America like Mexico and stuff, maybe Colombia too, it's like the double. Like it's more intense here. Compared to Latin America, where we have been living with this violent society since we can remember for years and years. So, what, in your personal opinion, what do you think that makes like Latin America community to don't have so much PTSD present in their life with the violence?
Thank you so much for your question. Several things to say, but I will try to be brief. So first of all, I have been studying more violence than victims, but saying that, most of the ex-combatants are victims also, so it's very frequent to find PTSD. But they are probably two different. So one is we are less systematic in research and intervention. So I'm not sure it's really a real difference number or not. We don't have good research on that. We have this kind of normalization of violence, that we were talking about. So it's normal. So what is PTSD? It's something that is becoming really, really normalized, especially because you not only have violence, you have inequalities, disparities. So you have many other problems, and this is part of your life. This is the allostatic overload effect, I would say, right? So this is another thing. And the other thing is, in my opinion, we don't need to focus only in PTSD. in my experience, these people need to relearn all the process to deal with social context, with social interactions, and not only PTSD, because this is a acute syndrome that happens mostly in victims, but there are many other mental processes that need to be addressed. Sorry.
Okay, Agustin.
Thank you so much.
So we move to our final speaker now, and I think it's a first for GBHI to have a political scientist speak here at Creative Brain Week. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Thomas Chadefaux. He's a professor in political science at Trinity College Dublin, and his research focus is on the causes of interstate conflict and on its prediction, and how big data, large data sets, may be able to pick up early signals and help us predict war and conflict. So it's all about prediction and possibly prevention. So, Thomas, welcome.
Thanks, Brian. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I don't really fit in the neuroscientist kind of mold. I'm a political scientist, but I try to recover from it. So I work here as a political scientist, but I work with a team of economists, physicists, machine learning students, to try to understand and predict the onset of conflict, not in a particular country, but globally. So we're trying to understand, uncover the patterns, the factors that lead to the onset of conflict in a particular country, at a particular time, in a particular setting. And what I want to try to convince you of today, and it's going to be a very sort of cursory overview of the field, or the problems we face. I want to discuss a number of things. One, I want to tell you that we're terrible at predicting. And that's not just me, that's everyone, and I want to give you a few examples. And the second thing I want to discuss is, well, maybe we're terrible at predicting conflict because it's really unpredictable. So I want to discuss this a little bit. And then finally, I want to review a little bit the kind of approaches that people have taken to try to get better at predicting, and the approaches that you can take to get better at predicting too. And there are some that actually work well. So we are a very poor predictor, and this is not just me saying this. There's a huge amount of evidence to show that I'm a poor predictor. You're probably great predictors, but aside from people in this room, people are usually terrible predictors. And that applies also to the experts. Actually, it applies particularly to the experts. So let me start with a little story. Around 2005, Apple introduced this little device. It's called the iPod Shuffle. I don't know if you remember this. But the way it works is you don't get to pick your song. It goes on and it picks a song randomly for you, right? So you have a playlist and it picks the next song. And then people started to complain to Apple and they said, look, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't shuffle properly. I get the same song twice in a row. It doesn't work. Right? And so people didn't quite understand that random means random. You might get the same song 3 times in a row. And so Apple essentially went back to the drawing board and they came up with a new iPod Shuffle that essentially shuffles less. So it's less random, but it appears more random to people because they're less likely to get the same song twice in a row. Here's another little story. There's an experiment that was done with students. There were students at an Ivy League institution. And the way it worked is that people had to predict essentially a sequence of lights, right? So you had a red light and a green light, and they had to predict which one was going to turn on next, right? And so you got a sequence: red, red, green, green, red, red, something like this, right? And the sequence, unbeknownst to the students, was random. Right? But the students kept trying really hard to come up with some kind of underlying pattern to say, well, geez, it was 3 reds and 1 green, must be red next, something like this, right? And so they had to predict the next sequence, and the results, you could probably guess, is that they actually performed very poorly. They performed worse than random. Now, they also had the rat do the exact same thing. Now, the rat wasn't looking at the light. The rat was trying to predict which side of the little maze the cheese was going to be in. And the rat actually quickly came up with the right solution, which was, always go to the left, always go to the right, because that's right 60% of the time, or something like this. Right? Okay, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because we as humans are good at trying to look for patterns. And we look for patterns where there are patterns, but we also look for patterns where there are no patterns. And because we're particularly good at trying to uncover patterns that don't exist, we end up being pretty bad at forecasting. So this is just a few fun examples of people who got it really wrong over the years. But what I want to say now is that this is really not specific to, these are really not just isolated cases. So there's a study that's been done that lasted 20 years, from 1980 to the 2000s. It's actually still ongoing, by Philip Tetlock. And the idea of this study is that we're going to ask experts, people who have advanced degrees, people who know a lot about stuff in general. We're going to ask them questions about the world. So we'll ask them, for example, who do you think is going to win the next election? Or what do you think the exchange rate is going to be between the euro and the US dollar in a year? Or do you think there will be a conflict in South Sudan next year? Or do you think any kind of questions like this, right? We ask them these questions, and these questions have a clear yes or no answer, right? So after the fact, the next year, we can go back and see, well, how right were they? Were they right? Did they get it right? Did they get it wrong? And this went with years with lots of people, mathematicians, engineers, social scientists, economists, etc. And what they found was that, I've told you already, the experts are not very good at predicting. In fact, they're not just pretty bad at predicting, but they're pretty much just as good as random. So if you ask the monkey to pick a dart and throw it at the board, that would do pretty much just as well as the experts. Right? So in other words, all these pundits that you're seeing on TV that tell you this is what's going to happen, there will be a war, this guy is going to be elected, the exchange rate is going up or down, you have to take that with a grain of salt. Right? And the reason for this, well, there's a number of reasons for this. On TV, it makes sense, right? It doesn't really sell to say, well, you know what, I'm not quite sure who's going to win the election, or I'm not quite sure about this. So you have to be certain, you have to be confident, right? But we also make the same mistakes. We tend to be overconfident in our assessment. And we also make other mistakes. We also tend to overestimate the probability of rare events. Right? So if I ask you, for example, what is the probability of a war between Switzerland and Sweden next year? Well, you're going to laugh and you can say, oh, it's very low. But you might say something like 0.1%. Right? But 0.1% is still way too low, way too high, I mean. Right? And so when we ask experts, or when we ask people like you and I, what do you think is the probability of that event? What do you think is the probability of a war between Russia and Latvia next year? Well, people are going to say a number, right? But we tend to overestimate these probabilities, or at least we tend to misestimate these probabilities. And we're also fairly reluctant to correct our mistakes. And so when we observe evidence that goes against our beliefs, we're fairly reluctant to change our estimate and review our estimated probabilities for the future. So this study is based on thousands and thousands of responses. So it's not just some fluke that, I made mistakes or you made mistakes. It's really literally thousands of people over 20 years. Okay, so you might say, well, okay, that's fine, but maybe this is sort of a fool's errand that you're running after, which is maybe there's nothing predictable about conflict, right? So one of the common things that people say is that, well, people are complicated. Right? And that's true, people are complicated, and they have free will, and they do whatever they want, and that's pretty much unpredictable. Right? That's true if we're talking about the individual level. Right? So if we're talking about the individual level, in fact, Agustin's talk before sort of goes towards this, it's very hard to predict who's going to do what. Right? It's going to be very hard to predict who's going to fight, who's not going to fight. But that's not what we're doing here. Right? What we're trying to predict is the aggregate level. And in the aggregate, this is something that sociologists have known for 150 years or more. In the aggregate, people tend to be fairly predictable. Right? So we're not trying to predict who will fight. We're trying to predict in the aggregate whether there will be a conflict. The other problem that we face is that we don't actually know what kind of world we live in. Right? So one world is in which we do something and the same thing always happens. Right? So some action leads to some reaction. I drop this device and it's going to fall to the floor. And I'm pretty confident it's going to happen every time. Right? But we might live in another world in which very tiny differences in initial conditions, right? So here we start with very similar initial conditions, but the place we end up is radically different. So it could be that the world looks like this, in which very small differences, by chance, lead to very different outcomes. And if that's the world we live in, then it's pretty much impossible to predict, right? So let me give you an example. Let me see if that works. Right. So this is what happens on June 28, 1914, where Franz Ferdinand ends up being assassinated. And of course, that's the beginning, or at least the spark that leads to the onset of World War I. Now, what people are less aware of is actually how the assassination took place, right? And how lucky, or rather unlucky, it was, right? So what happens is there's not just one terrorist, right? There's not just Gavrilo Princip, there's a number of them, right? And a number of them that are positioned on the street where Franz Ferdinand's car was going to be driving, right? So the first point here, number one, is where the first assassin is stationed. The first assassin gets cold feet and doesn't do anything, right? So the car moves on, nothing happens. The second point is another assassin, another terrorist. Again, gets cold feet, doesn't do anything. Okay? The third one is more determined, throws a bomb, but the bomb bounces off the roof of the car into the next car. Right? The bomb explodes, but the assassination fails. Right? By the way, this terrorist swallows an old cyanide pill because he sees he's failed. The pill is too old, so it doesn't work, so he just ends up vomiting. He throws himself into the river, but the river at this time of year, because it's summer, the river is only this deep, so it doesn't work well. The next step, so by now it's pretty clear to Franz Ferdinand that something is up and they better go fast, right? So they go fast to the next, which is a reception. Franz Ferdinand is of course upset. Gavrilo Princip has observed the whole endeavor, and he's quite upset, of course, because the assassination attempt has failed. So he positions himself at number 4 there, right? But number 4 is not where the car is supposed to go after the reception. The car is supposed to go through the bridge, which you see across number 4, right? But the driver, on the way back, takes a wrong turn. Whoops, just a complete accident. Turns there, is about to turn around to go back to the bridge, and that's when finally Gavrilo Princip, just by chance positioned there, shoots him. Okay. Are we supposed to anticipate this if we are going to predict the onset of World War I? No, this is just impossible to predict. We can't predict that. Number 3, the bomb is going to bounce back. These 2 terrorists are going to get cold feet, etc. That's just unpredictable, right? So we have essentially, it's like we have a bunch of acorns, and we know that great oaks come from acorns, but which of these acorns is going to lead to the great oak? We don't know, right? That's very hard to know. And in fact, it's even worse than this. If you think about the social sciences as opposed to physical sciences, we're dealing with processes that are a lot more complicated. If you think about the weather is notoriously complicated, difficult to predict, right? We have a very complex system with lots of moving parts and very chaotic system. But if you think about the social sciences, what we have is a world in which people are observing other people and reacting accordingly. It's as if the clouds were reacting to the forecaster and saying, they predicted rain, I'm going to go away and do it somewhere else, right? This is literally the way it works. If you think about, for example, if we study the effect of peacekeeping on peace, well, it's not just a matter of looking, all right, peacekeepers there, and let's look at the peace. Let's look at the amount of conflict in that area. That's not quite how it works, right? Peacekeepers just don't choose any location randomly. They don't just say, oh, you know what, Switzerland looks good, let's go there, right? They go to a place that's particularly, where they think they're going to be useful, or maybe they go to a place that's particularly difficult, or maybe they go to a place that's particularly easy. So they're looking forward to the effect that they anticipate they'll have. The population on the ground, the rebels on the ground, for example, notice the intervention of peacekeeper, or at least the intention to post peacekeepers, and are going to react accordingly. So, some sort of straightforward linear prediction about what's going to happen is very difficult because people are going to anticipate and react accordingly. Now, this is well known in finance, where, well, good luck predicting the financial market. Because people react accordingly. But the same happens in conflict. People react to predictions. People react to anticipations. So even if I was very, very successful and made predictions that world leaders listened to, right? They don't. But even if they did, my predictions would actually run the risk of being invalidated because they're too good. And if they're too good, people are going to listen. And if I say, well, there will be a conflict here, right? Then measures will be taken to send peacekeepers, for example, to try to prevent the conflict, negotiations, mediations, etc. And the conflict doesn't happen. My prediction is invalidated. I look like a fool. There's also a number of additional difficulties, which is that, in short, our data is terrible. Right? I hired someone from the medical sciences, and they have gigabytes upon gigabytes of data. And if they need more, they just get more. Right? I can't get more. There's only one history, right? And I can't run experiments where asking people to kill each other, right? So we have a number of problems, but one of them is measurement errors, right? So, for example, how many people died in a particular conflict? It's very hard to know. Right? I mean, even in Ukraine, which is one of the best documented conflict in ever, because we have all the social media, we have the videos, etc., there's no clear agreement on how many people, how many casualties there are. Right? So how are we supposed to study this subject if we don't have the most basic data? And there's something even more fundamental, something more fundamentally unpredictable, which is that suppose you're watching a game of tennis, right? You're watching a game of tennis, and Roger Federer is always hitting in the same place, right? Something is obviously wrong, right? He gets the same ball, he hits in the same place. No, that's not how people play tennis, right? Roger Federer is going to randomize where he shoots, where he strikes, right? Because if he doesn't randomize, he becomes predictable, it becomes easy to predict, and therefore he's going to lose. But the same happens in international relations, where you want to randomize your behavior. Sometimes you want to react a certain way, sometimes you want to react a different way. And that's by design, right? Your strategy should be unpredictable. And so inherently, there's an element of unpredictability in the social sciences in general, but in conflict in particular. So that's true, and that's kind of depressing for my field. On the other hand, there's a lot that's predictable about humans and about conflict in particular. There are rules to the game. I don't mean rules in the sense of legal rules that have to be followed, but there are rules in the sense of the way people follow their own interests in particular, and following their own interests will lead to the same kind of behavior ultimately. There are structural constraints. We know that Nicaragua and Mali are very unlikely to fight a war next year because they're separated by an enormous ocean and they don't have the ability to project power so far. There's also a lot of what we call autocorrelation over time, which is a lot of the past gives us a lot of information about the future. Right? So what happened next year is actually an excellent predictor of what's going to happen next year. The probability of conflict in Ukraine next year is obviously a lot higher than the probability of conflict in Switzerland. So these are kind of easy problems. We know that Switzerland won't have a civil war, and we're less sure about South Sudan. These are obvious, these are also boring, and you don't need me to tell you that. Right? So what we're looking for is something that at the margin is not boring like this, obvious, but is also not what we call a black swan event, which is something like the Gabriel Princip story, which is impossible to predict. Right? So it's in the between these two that we're essentially going to try to improve predictions. Okay, how do we do it? This is just going to be a very, very broad overview of the kind of things that we do, not at all any detail there. Well, the answer is actually that most people don't. Most political scientists don't care about forecasting. They just care about explaining what factors lead to something, not trying to anticipate what's going to happen in the future, what works in terms of prediction. But I think it's important to try to apply to our knowledge to things we haven't seen, and also it has important policy implications. Okay, so one way people do it is always something called game theory. So game theory, essentially a funny way of describing a mathematical tool that describes people with certain preferences, certain capabilities, so their strength, and how much they care about issues. So we might, for example, be interested in the politics of Iran and determine whether, well, will Iran intervene in a particular country? Well, to do this, we'll need some information about who the important actors are in the Iranian leadership, what do they care about, and how much power they have, and how much they care about things. And then loosely, we throw all these ingredients into a more or less complex model, and we try to understand how these actors are going to negotiate internally with one another, and who will come ahead, and which solution will come out as the outcome of this negotiation. So we don't observe these negotiations. We'd love to observe them, but we don't observe them, but we try to simulate them and come up with predictions about what's going to happen. Another way we do it is that we don't actually do it, we delegate it to you. And the way this works is with what's called the wisdom of crowds, which is the basic idea is a group of people is usually smarter, or at least better able to make predictions than a single person. So your errors, each of you is going to make an error when you predict, but your errors are essentially going to cancel out in a way that your prediction as a group will actually tend to be very good. Okay, what do these crowds look like? Well, they look like financial markets, for example. So if you think about financial markets, they are a collection of millions of people, each of which has a very strong interest in making a very good prediction because their money is at stake. Right? And if you aggregate these predictions, you get predictions that tend to be very good. So you have these betting markets online where people are betting on particular political outcome, who's going to win the election, will there be a war, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, there was a betting market that was set up by DARPA, the Department of Defense in the United States, where they were trying to predict where the next terrorist attack was going to occur. But then they realized that the terrorists were going to be able to bet on this and make a lot of money out of this. It was probably a pretty bad idea, so they withdrew it quickly. But there's also other approaches that use the wisdom of crowds. One of them that's very successful is called the Good Judgment Project. And the way this works is they ask people like you and me, sort of normal, well-educated people who are smart, and they ask them to make predictions. But they don't just aggregate these predictions, they also teach these people how to get better at prediction. So they teach these people how to work in groups. They teach these people how to learn from their mistakes. They teach these people how to take into account different sources of information. So don't just read the New York Times, but also maybe read Fox News or whatever. And it works. I'll show you results in a little bit. It works very well. Another way, so that's the way I do it, is to use a lot of statistics, machine learning, algorithms, and the idea here is we're going to take as many factors as we can, as much data as we can, throw these into a model and try to learn how these factors interact, how these correlate, to predict which of these factors is predictive of the onset of conflict and how we can combine them to better understand the onset. These work very well as well, but we're very much limited by the amount of data that we have. Right? So if you think about how much information, how much data we have, right now, I believe, depending on how you count, there's about 54 conflicts going on in the world. That's a lot. That's way too much. But if you think of it in terms of data points, 54 data points is a very small amount to learn from, right? And so I don't want to say that we need more, but we just don't have more to learn from, and therefore, it's very difficult to use some of the best statistical techniques in order to come up with predictions because there's just not enough data out there. Okay. It's surprisingly hard to tell you how well these models do. What I'll say is there are some experts that will come and tell you, you know what, my predictions are 95% accurate. I'm so good. Right? Don't believe these people, okay? Forget them. The reason they say they're 95% accurate is because 95% of the time there is no conflict, right? So if you say you predict 0, there will be no conflict next year, anywhere, you're going to be 95% accurate. Congratulations, right? But that's useless, of course. Right? So don't believe this kind of statement. Here's one way to present the kind of results we have, which is the results of a simple machine learning algorithm. So you can see that when we predict no conflict, most of the time there's no conflict. When we predict conflict, most of the time there's conflict. And of course, there are some errors there. But that's not too bad. But surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly to you, but amazingly perhaps, the winner every year, there's a competition like this, but the winner currently is the Good Judgment Project. So it's these people who are normal people, you and I type of people, who just happen to become good at forecasting. They become what we call super forecasters. And they become good because they've learned to be more critical of their own assessment and to revise their opinion in light of the information that they get. And that seems easy to say, right? Just revise your opinion, but it's actually very hard to do. Take into account new evidence and correct your own assessment. Okay, I don't know how I'm doing on time. 1 minute, perfect. So going forward, so I'm leading this project which is about finding temporal patterns of conflict. And what I'm interested in particular is trying to bridge the gap between the way experts approach the problem, which is a very sort of narrative way of thinking about it, which is, well, this is the sequence of events that happened, right? First, there was a coup. Second, there were protests. Third, there was a civil war. This kind of mental picture. And bridge the gap between this version of how we do things and the other one, which is the pure statistical approach, which is let's throw everything into a model and let's see what it spits out. The problem with these models is they're great at aggregating information, but they're not great at taking into account these potentially complex patterns that unfold over time. So I'm leading this project essentially trying to bridge the gap between the two and trying to uncover more complex patterns over time and how they might be leading to conflict. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward.
Great, Thomas. Thanks so much. Time for 1 or 2 questions before we go to the panel. A question up here. Okay, we'll wait for the mic.
Let's get my steps in. Thank you very much. That's fascinating. So I'm wondering whether there are certain circumstances where single variables can predict conflicts if you could measure them. And I'm thinking particularly of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which by all accounts seems to have really boiled down to the psychological factors of one man. His own foreign secretary didn't know about the invasion until about 3 hours before it was due to happen, for instance. So I'm wondering whether yes, for many situations, complex machine learning, multiple variables, but there are other situations where more conventional theories, if you like, or single variables can play a part.
Yeah, it's a great question. Two answers. So one, is there a variable that tends to predict conflict sort of reliably? Yes, but sadly is the most boring variable of all, which is, was there conflict in the past, and especially in the immediate past? So that's a boring answer, but that's the variable that really matters the most. But to your question about psychology, yes, the problem is that there are two problems. One is we don't have data, right? Obviously, we can't get in the head of Vladimir Putin, although we'd love to have this kind of data, but we don't. So there are people who do experiments with, and they say, well, you guys are the leaders, and you guys are the subjects. But that doesn't work, right? You can't just behave like a leader because I've told you, all right, you're the leaders in this experiment. So that doesn't really work. But the other answer I want to make is, yes, in hindsight, so it's all about Putin's psychology, it's true. But the thing is, there are loads of crazy leaders in the world, but they're not going to war. So even if we had this variable and we could measure it, we had this crazy variable or whatever, this grandiose psychological problems variable, I don't think it's going to be actually very predictive. I'm not sure, right? It might be, but I'm doubtful because I think there are lots of leaders that have the same grandiose ideas, and that doesn't lead to war. But I don't have a good answer because I don't have data.
Okay. Just one last question here then, and then we'll go to the panel.
Variables. Thank you for that. That was very, very interesting, and the examples were very engaging here. I wonder. So forecasts suck.
I can see it from here.
I wonder to what extent this is a consequence of the scope or the nature of the phenomena that you're targeting. So, I mean, could you provide an example of other forms of conflict that can actually be more effectively predicted? I'm thinking, I don't know, which kid is going to be bullied at school, which couple is going to divorce, because, I mean, if that were the case, maybe if we can see what are the parameters that differ between these massive, large-scale, international, unpredictable scenarios you're describing, and those that typify the ones that can be predicted, maybe a lesson could be derived therefrom. And if not, then maybe we're just doomed.
So I think it's a great question. It also goes to a fundamental question, I think.
Thomas, sorry, can I ask you to stand on the stage so
yeah,
that people online can see? Thank you.
Sorry. So I don't have a great example, right? The kind of conflict I study is just armed conflict, right, which doesn't deal with the kind of playground kind of conflict. There's a lot of research on, well, this kind of conflicts or domestic conflict, but also conflict between animals, for example, right? So chimpanzees fighting, etc., which is fascinating. But I don't know. Right, but two things. A, we still have bad data, but B, I don't know how much this carries over from one field to the next, right? So when we're talking about states, we're talking about very complex organizations. We're not talking about Jimmy bullying John, right? Which is more about, I would guess, in the realm of sentiments and feelings, etc., anger. In international relations, it could be that it's all about Vladimir Putin's anger or grandiose ideas, but a lot of it is about, even if you think about terrorist organizations, these are very strategic or complex organizations that are trying to achieve some goals, and they're very strategic in how they do this, and anger may be a role, but I'm not convinced that it's actually that important a role.
Okay, so if we just have about 10 or 15 minutes left for maybe a panel discussion, maybe I could just invite Ciaran and Agustin maybe up to the stage, and we just take. Thanks so much. So it's just an opportunity, perhaps, to ask some questions of the panel. We draw some themes together. A question here. And thanks, Alison.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Sorry, it's on. Can we? So I just want to ask the panel, as I said, about the importance of game theory, and not just predicting the onset of conflict as well, but predicting the possibility of its ending. And as I said, and the probability of factors that you mentioned up there too, predicting the ending of conflicts and how game theory, like used by political scientists in here in many circumstances, could have a practical significance in that regard, or would just be out of random or stochastic factors that will be beyond your control. Thank you.
Okay. I guess that's a question for you, Thomas.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's interesting because I started my career as a game theorist and I left it. Good choice. I changed games. And I left it because a lot of all right, so game theory is largely going to be dependent on the input that you have, right? So if you think about someone like, there's this professor called Bruce Mosqueda who does this kind of work, and he does forecasts that are based on, he throws a bunch of data into his model and outspits an outcome, right? The problem is a lot of it is dependent on input from experts. So he goes to experts and he says, all right, who matters in Iran? Tell me, right? Okay, this guy. What do they care about? Okay, write it down. Okay, so you get all this data and you put it into the model. In the end, I'm not entirely convinced that what you get is very different from just, you take the 2 points, you draw a line in between, and that's your prediction, right? He claims he makes great predictions. The Department of Defense, or the CIA actually, pays a substantial money for these predictions, and that's great. But in terms of publicly available evidence that it works, there's less of it. So I don't have a good answer for you in that sense. Right?
Agustin, did you want to comment?
I think that I don't want to be a hard critic of the game theory, but at least in social interactions and neuroscience, there is a strong evidence that it's departing from absolutely wrong assumptions, like the maximization of behavior. That is even in the prospect theory and in more advanced theories. So when we cooperate, our brain is feeling reward. So it's a way, because of that, people tend to cooperate more than the theory predicts, because it's part of the reward. So I think that game theory is a good formalization, but it's based in wrong assumptions about human interactions. Sorry.
No, I think, but I mean, if I can just add to this, I think that it goes back to my example about the experiment and leaders, right? So we're essentially trying to model leaders in the lab with, sociology 101 kind of students. There's nothing wrong with sociology students. It's just they're not facing the same kind of constraints, the same mental environment. And you're talking about leaders who are going to be much more rational to the defense of game theory, much more rational than we observe in the lab. Sometimes, maybe not Putin. So I don't have a great answer. I think it has a lot of potential in that sense, but it's unclear whether it can.
Okay, can I just a question to the panel really about the, creativity for brain health, really, in terms of, if you look at the impact of the Troubles or what happened in Colombia, there was very innovative and creative physical reconstruction. You showed examples of that, but I'm just wondering, in terms of brain reconstruction or brain repair, how can we bring creativity to that, to the stage here in terms of, let's say, the Troubles in Northern Ireland or in Colombia? And I don't know whether, Thomas, you might have some comments in terms of from the political science point of view and the prediction. But I'm just curious about any thoughts on that, where this can go.
I can mention some projects. I think that is the best way to try to understand. This idea that the way that you cope with the repeated stress that happened in the past or in the present, whatever, and the way that you self-regulate is important for healing. This is, something that comes also from biology. It's not only, clinical approaches can be exploited, because So, for instance, using theater, I think that there are some experience in Ireland. I'm not sure about that, but putting together people that are from both sides, and through theater learns to self-regulate. And you are re-experience that in that moment. So you have options for healing, using paint, using music. As we have this project in Argentina. It's not about conflict, but it's about violence also. So the children in that part of Argentina have a lot of treatments from drugs, violence, robbery, etc. So we want to provide a different experience and trying to resignify that. So I think that there are many projects. In painting, it's part also to create a sense of community, working together. So those projects, I'm pretty sure, maybe Dominic or you know about that in Ireland. And the other thing that I'm really interested in, to understand how much the socio-cultural context make an influence. Like, for instance, in Colombia, dance is a very easy way to induce kind of interventions. And what can be, transcultural?
Okay.
Ciaran, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to, adopt the Seamus Heaney line and be not too optimistic, but I think there are two problems. One is with regard to high art, high culture, and the ordinary person's sense of culture, and the other is the problem of divided societies. So in Northern Ireland, young people all share the same international culture as young people all over the world. It's the same music, the same TV programs, the same movies. They share that, but they don't share the same culture in the sense of what sport they play, or music such as the Alien Pipe that we heard earlier. They don't come together in terms of the local culture, even though they share an international culture. And in terms of theatre and painting and novels and art and poetry, of course, it can bring people together, and of course, I think it can contribute to brain health and brain repair. But it is high art, isn't it? It's not shared by most people, most young people. So I'm very interested, but it's easy to be interested in the use of art for reparative means, but I'm just not sure how it translates into the wider domain. And in terms of the earlier question about predicting conflict, I think we can predict conflict in the one way you've already mentioned, that the past predicts the future. So would there be a conflict one day between Russia and Ukraine, given their history? Always seemed possible, but unlikely it would happen in 2022. Would First World War have happened at some point, given all of the... Yes. Will the Troubles return? Will there be conflict again in Ireland, in the north of Ireland? To me, everything says yes, unless we do something about it. And what we do about it is we create a shared culture, a shared sense of being together, a shared future. And if we stay in our lagers, with our separate mentalities, we're not going to achieve that. That sounds like a negative comment. I am an optimist. I think there can be a coming together in Ireland, in the north of Ireland, which prevents conflict. I think it's possible, but there's lots of countervailing forces at the present time, and there aren't enough people alert to the dangers of conflict in the future. And I'm very interested in art and culture, but how do we translate that into the everyday lives of the majority of people? That's not so easy.
I think that the critical point is communities, right? So because usually arts can blend people together, but you need to have a strong sense of community in order to create these long-term changes in the community. In my experience, I never was thinking in communities before we started this kind of project, and I realized how important are for continuity in this process, especially because maybe, cognitive therapy in Colombia has been implemented, but with no success. I think that emotional components and self-emotional regulation and the way that you learn to respond to, violence, it need to touch socio-emotional aspect also, right? I'm not sure that the cognitive therapy I am not optimistic in the other side, that it is the only way to heal.
Well, maybe just I've got to ask one last question of the three of you in terms of where things may go. Because I think that, I guess with the peace process, there's a lot of fragility there at the moment, isn't there? I think we need to think creatively about where we need to go in terms of maintaining peace and reducing conflict and finding solutions. So my question really is around creativity. what creative ideas would each of you have in terms of moving forward and reducing conflict? Perhaps whether it's Colombia, Northern Ireland, or world conflict. I mean, any creative ideas that we maybe take this morning and maybe bring to this afternoon as we're looking more at the arts, neuroscience,
don't know if I have
conflict
a
resolution.
great idea, but I think one thing is important to understand, and there's a lot of statistical evidence for it, is that ethnic or linguistic fractionalization does not cause conflict. Right? A lot of countries are fractionalized, separated, split into different religions, different groups, different identities. These, surprisingly maybe, but don't cause conflict. There's no correlation between the two. Right? Switzerland, exactly. But conflict does create ethnic linguistic fractionalization. It does split people apart. If you think about Bosnia before the conflict, people were intermarrying. After the conflict, not so much, right? So conflict splits people apart. There have been experiments, initiatives to try things, sounds a bit silly, but like telenovelas, right? So we have say Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda, whatever, that are falling in love, etc. And these kinds of romance, whatever it is, can this, I think, make a difference. It's just small, of course, and it's after the conflict. It's not preventative, but this is something that would be worth exploring, I think.
Okay. Agustin, creativity and so
well, I think that we need creativity to understand how fast violence is changing in the world, because when we think in violence, we think in wars, in civil wars, but the way that intergenerational violence is changing. So that in Ireland, probably the level of alcoholism in people that come from families that were exposed to violence should be larger. This is happening in many places of the world. This means that violence is changing. And when we think in globalization, for me it's a really difficult to anticipate the mechanisms for violence. Those are changing extremely quickly. When you look at social media in teenagers, you immediately realize that the expression of violence is different, like the bullying behavior that we have when we were young. For me, I don't have an answer, I have a question. How we can anticipate to this extremely quick process of change that we are not prepared at all. I think that globalization is the example regarding violence. We live in a global world, but we are not prepared at all. So we need to think in the future and this intergenerational transformation of violence.
But I get the sense we can learn from one another, from our experiences.
Okay, well,
Final word.
Yes, I'll follow up on that because it's all about young people ultimately. It's about children. And in Northern Ireland, unfortunately, children are educated either in Catholic schools or in Protestant state schools, and that hasn't changed. It hasn't changed over the last 25 years. The percentage in integrated schools is very low. But there is a programme which was called Education for Mutual Understanding. I think it is a new title now, which means that children in primary schools and secondary schools, that they have a twin school from the other community and they meet together on a regular basis. Now, that can be derided and can be or can be a little bit superficial, and maybe sometimes it is, but I think that is something that we need to build on, follow through, make it as creative as possible, find ways to break down the barriers that are real and meaningful, though perhaps the only real way to do it meaningfully is to actually integrate education, which isn't about to happen. So I think more effort on that theme would be beneficial.
That's reminiscent of Cooperation North and those efforts, maybe 30 years ago. I think Chuck Feeney was involved, Atlantic Philanthropies were involved in supporting that.
That's right.
So, that brings us right back to where we started. So, I just want to thank the panel and speakers, I think, for a wonderful contribution. I think we've had a very good start to Creative Brain Week on conflict. There's a lot to be done, I think, in terms of conflict resolution. But I'm looking forward to this afternoon, I think, where we're going to be moving more into creative interventions in terms of how we might be able to deal with conflict. So once again, thanks to speakers.